I never thought my life would be interrupted by a woman holding a bridal bouquet at my front door. The dovetail joint I had been working on was tight, but not perfect. I ran my thumb over the seam where walnut met maple. To anyone else, it was flawless, a clean marriage of contrasting grain, but I could feel the ridge, a fraction of a millimeter, a breath of air where there should have been solid wood. I exhaled slowly, set my tools down, and picked up the chisel again. I set it to the empty room like I always did. The barn was my universe. 3,000 square feet of converted agricultural space tucked away from the rest of the world, insulated against the damp chill of the Pacific Northwest rainforest. It smelled of sawdust, linseed oil, and the bitter tannic edge of white oak. Outside, the storm that had bullied the coast all night had finally started to loosen its grip. Rain shifted from violent downpour to a soft drizzle. The wind still rattled the gutters, but the worst of it was moving inland. Weather was honest. It told you what it was going to do. Wood could lie. Wood could twist 3 days after you finished a piece if you didn't read the grain direction correctly. It remembered the wind that shaped it. Sometimes it fought back. I adjusted the magnifying lamp above me, narrowing my world down to the single joint on the workbench. I had designed my life to be like this. Simple, predictable, safe. I was 32 and spent the last 5 years making sure nothing in my life was unpredictable. Furniture that would outlive me. 6 hours of sleep every night. Steel-cut oats at the same time every morning. Quiet, solitary, designed. But then I heard it. A crunch of gravel outside. It cut through the steady hush of my workshop. Not the wind. Not a branch. Footsteps. Uneven. Rushed. My ears picked it up immediately, and I paused, listening. The barn was tucked far off the county road, behind a thicket of fir trees and blackberry bushes. People didn't come out here by accident. Another sound followed, soft knock, then a firmer one. It was polite, tentative, like someone trying to act like they knew what they were doing while their hands shook. I set my chisel down. The steel clicked softly against the bench. Before I moved, my eyes flicked to the lowest drawer of my tool chest, the one that didn't hold tools. I kept it shut, kept it quiet. Inside, there were things from a life I didn't talk about, things I didn't want to talk about. A brass pin with an eagle stamped into it. A certificate with my name embossed on it. A photo from Washington, D.C. workshop full of white gloves and museum lights. I crossed the concrete floor, unlocked the pedestrian door, and opened it. Daylight spilled in, pale and clean after the storm. The rain had let up, and the clouds had torn just enough to let the sun through. The driveway was a river of mud and pine needles. The air smelled like soaked cedar and diesel. And there she was. A woman on my porch holding a bridal bouquet like it weighed 100 pounds. Her hair was dark and damp, curled from the humidity and stress. Her makeup was wiped away, leaving faint shadows beneath her eyes. She wore a simple ivory slip-top under a thin wrap, and a veil looped over her wrist like she didn't know where to put it anymore. The hem of her skirt was muddy from the walk up my driveway, but it was her posture that caught my attention. She didn't look fragile, but determined, like she had chosen pain over surrender, and had already paid the first installment. She lifted her eyes to mine. "You're Becket Foster," she said. Her voice didn't shake, but her hands did. I didn't know her, but I recognized the look. Trouble. It never arrived alone. It came with perfume and paperwork, and men who smiled too much. "You're at the wrong house," I said. Her eyes narrowed, unshaken. I know exactly where I am. And that was the moment I knew this wouldn't be a simple encounter. This woman had come here for something, and I wasn't sure if I was the one who could give it to her. But, like any force of nature, she wasn't waiting for my permission. "Travis told me you fix things," she said, her hands gripping the bouquet tighter, like it might just slip out of her fingers if she didn't hold on. I didn't want to entertain this. "I'm a furniture maker," I said flatly, "not a crisis hotline." She didn't flinch. "I canceled my wedding," she said. "I walked out." Quote. I held her gaze, trying to read her. "That's not my problem." Quote. "It will be," she said softly, the fear finally leaking through her control. "Mark already made it my problem." Quote. My mind flicked to the worst-case scenario. It wasn't just a runaway bride, it was something worse. Her fingers trembled as she reached into the folds of her wrap and pulled out a folded envelope, thick paper with a legal letterhead. She opened it with fingers that didn't want to work and held it out to me. I didn't take it immediately. I scanned the first line, temporary financial hold. Beneath that was a sentence designed to ruin a life. My eyes snapped up to her. "Who wrote this?" Quote, "Mark's attorney," she replied. And my mother signed as concerned family. I finally took the letter from her hand, folding it neatly before I spoke again. "What do you want?" Quote, she hesitated, then held up the bouquet like a confession. "I don't want to go back there. Not alone. Not until I have proof I'm not crazy. And not until I have something they can't take." Her voice cracked slightly, but she still held it together. "I need somewhere to breathe for one day," she said, a faint whisper. "Just one." I didn't have answers for her, but, like the piece of wood on my workbench, this was a problem I could shape. I motioned for her to come inside. "Get in here before someone sees you." She didn't hesitate, stepping over the threshold into the warmth of the barn. Her eyes scanned the space quickly, but she didn't look around like a tourist. She looked like someone picking exits, calculating her next move. I locked the door behind her, the sound of the bolt sliding into place, somehow making the place feel even more isolated than before. It was just the two of us now. She stood near the workbench, clutching the bouquet like it still had some meaning to her, but it was clear the world had already started to strip that away. She was shaking, and I could see her trying to hold it together, but there was something raw about the way her hands gripped the stems. "You're soaked," I said, nodding toward the small bathroom off the shop floor. "There are coveralls and an old flannel on the hook. Go warm up. I'll be here when you're done." Quote, she didn't argue, which was telling. She had to be used to arguing. So instead of words, she nodded, a slight movement, and walked toward the bathroom without looking back. As she disappeared into the small room, I focused on the letter she'd given me, reading it fully now. It was just what I expected. Paperwork with teeth. The kind that changed lives without even needing a voice. I took a photo of the letter on my workbench with my own phone, capturing every word, every line, every detail. Evidence. I wasn't going to let this be a story told by someone else. While she was changing, I made my rounds. I checked the perimeter. I counted doors, tested locks, and went up to the loft window to see if anyone was coming down the driveway. No cars, no signs of movement. I wasn't being paranoid. I was being smart. When I returned to the workbench, I grabbed two things from the cabinet. Things I didn't normally show clients: a small lockbox and a motion sensor camera. I hadn't used either since last year when a theft nearly cleaned me out. I placed them both on the bench, giving them a quick check before I stashed the lockbox under the bench for now. The camera would go in the loft with the batteries. Better to have it and not need it than the other way around. By the time Elena came back out, I'd already set myself into the rhythm of the shop again. It was what I did best. There was no room for hesitation. There was just the wood, the tools, and the work. She returned, dressed in my coveralls, sleeves rolled up to her elbows, hair still damp at the ends. The ivory slip she'd had on earlier was nowhere to be found. Instead, she wore my clothes like she'd been trying to hide herself in them, to become smaller, less noticeable. But I saw her. She set the bouquet down on the workbench and lifted the small wooden box from her tote, wrapped in a plastic dry cleaning bag. The box was old, but its craftsmanship was undeniable. The joints were sharp and clean. The inlay was intricate, delicate, with rosewood and satinwood mother-of-pearl that caught the light even through the plastic. It was the kind of piece that deserved to be handled with reverence, not discarded like it was nothing. But this was no ordinary object. It was broken. The lid was crushed, the hinge line misaligned. Someone had forced it. I set the magnifying lamp over it, stripping away the plastic with careful fingers. "This isn't a drop," I muttered to myself, inspecting the damage. I could tell from the first glance. The wood had been compressed by high force, not dropped or accidentally bruised. Her breath caught behind me. "So, he lied," she said, her voice tight with frustration. I nodded, examining the fracture lines more closely. Yeah, this was done on purpose. Someone used force to damage it. Quote. She didn't argue. Instead, she leaned in, watching me like she was learning something new. I could see the way her mind worked, focused, sharp, but buried under layers of confusion and fear. He said it was an accident, she added, her voice low. Then he laughed. I didn't need to ask who he was. I could tell from the tone, the way her eyes flickered when she spoke. Mark. I lifted the splintered wood with tweezers, my mind already processing how to fix it. I can stabilize the wood, I said. The structure can be rebuilt. But the mechanical restoration, that's another job. I'm not a specialist in that. She nodded quickly. I have someone lined up for that, she said. My grandfather's friend, but I need to know the box is safe first. If Mark gets this box, he'll lose it like he loses everything else. He'll destroy it. Quote. I looked at her, seeing the determination in her eyes. I wasn't in the habit of fixing things for people I didn't know, but this was different. This was something more. Something serious. Why not call the police? I asked, already knowing what she was going to say. Her mouth pressed into a thin line. Because Mark's father funds half the precinct's gala dinners, she said. And the minute I say the word, abuse, my mother says, mental break, and his lawyer says, evaluation. They don't need to prove I'm unfit. They just need to stall me long enough to make it real. I took a breath, feeling the weight of her words. Then we play this the right way, I said, setting the box down carefully. We make sure there's evidence, and we keep the story in our hands, not theirs. She watched me for a long moment, then slowly, her shoulders loosened. Okay, she said quietly. But I need somewhere to breathe for one day. Just one. I nodded. You'll have it, and when you're ready, we'll figure this out. Step by step. She took a long breath, the first one that seemed to calm her down and let the tension leave her shoulders. It wasn't a relief. Not yet. But it was a start. And that was enough for me. The next morning, the storm was still pressing in from the coast, but it had softened just enough to let the faint light filter through the windows of the barn. The smell of wet earth and cedar mingled with the scent of sawdust and freshly cured wood. The air was cool but dry inside, the only warmth coming from the wood stove in the corner. The quiet of the shop had a strange weight to it now, like the calm before something was about to happen. Elena was still asleep upstairs in the loft. The way she'd settled into the space the night before was different from how I'd seen people enter my shop. Most guests treated the place like a tourist attraction, poking around, uneasy in the stillness. But Elena had moved with purpose, like she belonged here, like she had found her place in a world that was not her own but could be. That was something I hadn't seen in a long time. People didn't come to me for refuge. They came for furniture, for craft. But Elena, she came for something else. I was already at the workbench, focused on the box. I had made progress, but I was still a long way from finishing. My hands were steady as I carefully shaped the new components, rebuilding the hinge and cleaning the fractured edges. My mind was sharp, but my thoughts kept drifting back to her, how she'd walked in here, disheveled, but with a resolve that only seemed to grow the longer she stayed. It was a few hours before she came downstairs, wrapped in a quilt, her hair pulled back in a messy bun. The clothes she had borrowed, my coveralls, were too big for her, the sleeves rolled up at the cuffs, but she wore them like they were a shield, like she was trying to disappear into them. But even in oversized clothes, there was no hiding her presence. She took a seat at the workbench, her eyes flicking over the tools, the pile of wood, and then finally settling on the box in front of me. I didn't say anything. I knew she had questions, but I wasn't in a hurry to answer them. "How's it going?" she asked, her voice soft, unsure. I glanced up from the box, wiping my hands on a rag. Slowly. "It's a delicate thing, but we'll get there." Quote. Her eyes lingered on the box, watching me like I was performing some sort of ritual. She was quiet for a long time, her fingers curling around the edges of her mug, the steam from her tea rising into the air. Finally, she spoke again. "I didn't think I'd end up here," she said, her voice low. "I didn't think I'd end up needing to fix something like this. I didn't look up from my work. Things break. It's how you fix them that counts." She was quiet for a moment, the sound of the wood under my tools filling the space between us. "Do you ever get tired of fixing things?" Quote. I paused, the question hanging in the air. I don't fix people. I fix wood. There's a difference. Elena nodded, but I could tell the question was still lingering in her mind. She stood up and moved to the corner of the shop where a canvas had been set up on an easel. I didn't ask her what she was doing. She seemed lost in it, and I wasn't about to interrupt. For the next hour, I worked in silence, the rhythmic sound of the tools on wood filling the space as Elena painted in the corner. The paintbrushes moved with purpose, sweeping across the canvas in fluid motions. Her concentration was absolute, but there was something else in her movements, an urgency, a need to escape her thoughts, maybe, or to express what she couldn't say out loud. By the time I finished with the hinge, the storm outside had settled into a light drizzle, the kind that didn't feel urgent but was constant. I wiped my hands on a towel, then grabbed my phone, glancing at the time. It was late afternoon. The weather was still bad enough that no one would risk the drive down my dirt road, but I knew that could change quickly. The last thing I needed was for someone to show up unannounced. I walked over to the loft window, looking down the gravel driveway. A few pine trees swayed in the wind, but the road remained empty. Still, something in my gut told me that wouldn't last. People like Mark didn't just let things go. "Are you done yet?" Elena's voice broke into my thoughts. I turned to find her standing in the doorway, her arms crossed over her chest, watching me. Her eyes were steady, but there was something softer about the way she looked at me now. Like she was seeing me for who I really was, not just the guy who fixed things. I nodded toward the workbench. "Almost. The rest is in the details." She didn't move, just stood there for a beat before speaking again. "I don't want to go back," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "But if I don't, I'm afraid of what happens next." I could feel the weight of her words, heavy in the air. It wasn't just the box, the letter, or even the gallery. This was something deeper, something that went beyond the paper she had in her hand and the fear that had driven her here. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore, she was fighting for the truth, and she knew it. "You're not alone," I said, my voice steady. I didn't know why I said it, but I meant it. "Not here." She met my gaze, her eyes flicking to the motion sensor camera I had set up in the corner. She hadn't said anything about it, but I knew she'd noticed. "What happens when they come for me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then we handle it," I said, turning back to the workbench. "Quiet, calm, and we make sure we've got everything we need to stand our ground." She walked over to where the box was now, its damage nearly repaired. She didn't touch it. But I could see her thinking, the gears in her mind turning. It was clear this wasn't just about a music box anymore. This was about everything that had been taken from her, and everything she was about to fight to get back. By the time evening settled in, the storm had passed. The air had cleared, and the barn felt like a safe place again, a place where things didn't break. Not unless they were supposed to. I looked at Elena, who was sitting back down at the workbench, her eyes focused on the box, her hands resting on the smooth wood like it was the only thing that could steady her now. And for the first time since she walked through that door, I started to believe that maybe, just maybe, she'd find the strength to rebuild everything that had been shattered in her life. The rain had finally stopped, the sky was clearing, but the quiet of the storm lingered in the air. The barn felt smaller now, quieter. Maybe it was the absence of the storm, or maybe it was something else, something shifting between Elena and me. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but it was there, settling between us, like the wood on my workbench. I was trying to focus on finishing the repairs to the music box, but every time I looked up, my gaze found her. She was seated at the corner of the shop, surrounded by paints and brushes. She had barely touched the canvas since I'd returned to the work, but she was lost in thought, her eyes distant, tracing the lines of her memories on the air between us. There was something in the way she sat, shoulders tight, brow furrowed, like she was carrying the weight of everything she hadn't said. She didn't talk much about why she was here, about what led her to cancel her wedding and show up on my doorstep with a bouquet in hand. But I didn't need her to say it. I could read the cracks in her eyes, the way her hands trembled when she first held the box. Elena wasn't just escaping Mark's world. She was fighting for something much bigger. And I was starting to understand that. I finished the last delicate touches on the box, replacing the final screw that held the mechanism together. I gave it a final inspection, turning the key just to hear the familiar, sweet chime of the music playing. The melody rang through the barn, soft and steady. The box was whole again, and for the first time in days, I felt a slight release in my chest. Elena didn't look up when I finished. She didn't need to. She already knew what it meant. I closed the lid, then set the box down on the workbench. I wiped my hands on the cloth, glancing back over at her. She had set the brush down on the side and was standing now, her eyes focused on the door, as though waiting for something or someone. "You ready?" I asked, not sure if I was asking about the box or if I was asking about the weight of the world she was carrying. She nodded, her jaw tight, but the determination in her eyes hadn't faltered. She was ready, I could tell. "Then let's go." I grabbed the padded case where I'd placed the box, carefully wrapping it for transport, then glanced over to the wall where I'd stored the letter and receipts. Everything was ready, every piece of evidence in place, waiting to be shown. She walked towards me without hesitation, her hand reaching for mine. Her fingers weren't trembling anymore. The woman who had walked into my barn that day, drenched and uncertain, had been replaced by someone else, someone fierce and certain, someone who had decided she would no longer be hidden. She would be seen, and she would be heard. We left the barn, and as we stepped outside, the cool air wrapped around us, the smell of wet pine lingering in the breeze. The gravel crunched underfoot as we made our way to the truck, the steady rhythm of the drive comforting in its familiarity. The sky was clearing, the storm's remnants still hanging in the air like a memory. But I knew as we drove toward Oak Haven that whatever awaited us there, we would face it together. The small town was quiet when we pulled into the parking lot of the gallery. The Oak Haven Winter Gala was in full swing, the gallery doors thrown wide open to invite guests inside. The kind of event that made everyone inside feel important. The kind of event where people hid their true faces behind smiles and expensive suits. It wasn't my world. It wasn't Elena's world either, but she was about to step into it, armed with something much stronger than a designer dress or a carefully crafted smile. She was armed with the truth. I parked the truck right in front of the gallery. Valet attendants scurried around, parking luxury cars and offering fake smiles to the guests as they filed in. I didn't care about the people who were here. I cared about Elena. And whatever happened next, it wouldn't be just about her mother and Mark anymore. It would be about showing them who Elena really was. She glanced over at me, her face unreadable. She was calm now, but there was a fierceness behind her eyes, a quiet strength that she had never shown before. The gallery lights flickered against her face, reflecting the change in her. "If this goes bad," she started. "It won't," I said, cutting her off. "But if it does, you stay behind me." She nodded, not because she was scared, but because she understood what I meant. If we were going to do this, we would do it on our terms. We walked inside together, and the change was instant. The room was filled with hushed conversations, people draped in silken velvet, the smell of champagne in the air. The clink of glasses and soft laughter filled the space, but the moment Elena walked in, everything shifted. Heads turned, eyes darted. It was Mrs. Murphy who saw her first, and her expression froze. "Elena," she said, her voice loud enough to be heard across the room. It wasn't a greeting, it was an accusation. Mark was beside her, his face carefully neutral, but I could see the tension in his shoulders. He was ready to play his part. But not this time. Elena stepped forward, no hesitation, no doubt. She looked at her mother with steady eyes, and then to Mark. "I'm here to finish what you started," she said, her voice clear, unwavering. Mrs. Murphy's smile faltered. "You've been missed," she said, but the words sounded rehearsed. Elena wasn't buying it. "I bet you were," she replied, her voice cutting through the polite facade of the room. Mark stepped forward, his hand reaching for her, but I was already there. I moved into the space between them, blocking him. He was surprised, of course. He thought his money could buy everything, including Elena's silence. "Don't touch her," I said, my voice low but firm. "This is over." Mark's jaw tightened, but he didn't make a scene. Not yet. He stepped back, but his eyes burned with something darker now, rage. Elena stood her ground, looking at him and then at her mother. "This is the proof," she said, lifting the padded case and setting it down on the cocktail table. She opened it carefully, taking out the box and turning the key. The sweet, bell-like music filled the room, and for a moment it was the only sound in the place. Mark's confidence wavered as the room took notice. Elena laid out the photos, the letters, the receipts, all of it, proof that he had lied, manipulated, and controlled her life. The room went silent, and for the first time in a long time, Mark was the one being judged. "You said it was an accident," Elena said, her voice calm, "but the woods says otherwise." One of the older men at the front, a collector, leaned forward and studied the box. "Those are tool marks," he murmured, his voice soft but certain. "Deliberate." Mark's smile cracked, the mask slipping. He couldn't charm his way out of this one. The crowd was shifting now, whispers moving through the gallery like a ripple of understanding. "You don't know who you're messing with," Mark finally said, his tone sour. Elena didn't flinch. "I think we both know exactly who's been messing with who." I glanced at her then. Her hands weren't shaking anymore. The woman who had walked into my barn was gone. In her place stood a woman who had decided she would no longer be invisible. The applause came slowly, then all at once. A few hesitant claps at first, then louder, as people realized what they had just witnessed. Mark stormed off, his temper finally winning over his control. Elena didn't look at the crowd. She didn't need their approval. She looked at me. "We did it," she whispered. "We did," I said, offering her my hand. And this time, when she took it, there was no hesitation. She wasn't just walking into the future anymore. She was stepping into a world where she controlled her story. And I was right there beside her. As we walked out of the gallery, the night air was cooler, but it didn't matter. She had already started to rebuild. And I was proud to be there to help her piece it all back together. A month had passed since that night at the gallery, since Elena had walked in and taken control of her story. Things had settled into a new rhythm. The storm outside had been replaced by a quieter, more peaceful kind of stillness, but the air still felt fresh, like something had been reborn. The shop smelled different now. Sawdust was still there, oak and walnut filling the air, but there was a new scent in the barn, the sharp, clean scent of turpentine and oil paint mixed with the wood. It was subtle, but it was there. Elena had transformed part of the storage bay into a makeshift studio, surrounded by jars of brushes and jars of paint and canvas leaning against the walls. She had found her way not just in my world, but in her own, and the space reflected it. I had started a new project, a commission for a cradle. The work was slow, meticulous, the same way it always had been. But now there was a kind of peace in my actions. No more distractions, no more unease. Just wood and tools, shaping something new, something beautiful. I was smoothing the curved runners when I felt Elena's eyes on me. She had been painting for the past hour, but she was quiet, as she often was when she was lost in her thoughts. I didn't stop my work but tilted my head slightly, acknowledging her presence without breaking my concentration. She had come a long way from the woman who had walked into my shop all those weeks ago, afraid, unsure, shaking with the weight of everything she'd been forced to endure. Now her hands were steady. When she painted with purpose, each stroke filling the canvas with something she couldn't say with words. And I respected that. It was the same way I worked. Each stroke of my chisel or brush was an expression of something deeper, something that words couldn't quite capture. She stopped painting for a moment and met my eyes across the shop. Her smile was small but real, a quiet acknowledgement that the world was different now. "Still checking the light?" she asked, walking over to me, her feet light on the concrete floor. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I reached for the cradle, my fingers brushing the smooth edges, feeling for the subtle imperfections. "I'm checking the set," I said, tapping the inlay on the curved runner, the mother of pearl shimmering in the light from the workbench. "Nothing gets past me." She nodded, her gaze flicking to the motion sensor camera I had set up when the road was still a threat, when we didn't know if they would show up again. The camera was still there, perched in the loft, still waiting for something, just in case. Elena looked back at me, her expression soft. "It's still on," she said, her voice carrying a kind of quiet understanding. "The porch light. You've been keeping it on every night since I got here." I nodded, not even needing to explain why. It's always been on. The porch light had been on since that first night she arrived, that night when everything had started to change. It wasn't just a light. It was something else. A sign, maybe, that no matter how dark it got, there was always a place where things could be steady, could be right. She walked over to where I was working and stopped beside me, her hands brushing against the tools on the bench. She didn't touch anything, just stood there, quiet and present. "You were right, you know," she said, her voice soft as she leaned against the bench. "About the wood. About the way you shape it." I glanced up at her, meeting her gaze. "It doesn't lie. It remembers." She smiled, the kind of smile that was quiet but certain. "It remembers," she repeated. We were silent for a moment, just listening to the sounds of the barn, the faint hum of the generator running in the background, the soft click of my tools. And then, the smallest shift. Elena stepped closer, her body warm in the cool space, and without saying anything, pressed her lips to my jaw. Quick, but soft. Her kiss wasn't full of drama or desperation. It was steady, like the hands of a craftsman who knew exactly what they were doing. It was a simple, quiet moment, but it spoke volumes. When she pulled away, she rested her forehead against my shoulder, breathing deeply as if she could finally let go. The music box sat on the mantel of the wood stove now, quiet, the lid closed, the birds still. No longer a symbol of broken promises or fear, but of something that had been mended, something that had been rebuilt with patience and care, just like everything else. I pulled away from her, but I kept my hand on her waist, steady. She wasn't going anywhere. "The storm's over," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, like she was finally letting herself believe it. But it was never about surviving the storm, was it? Quote? I shook my head, my hand moving to her chin, gently lifting her gaze. No, it was about what we build afterward, about what we choose to make from the wreckage. Elena smiled, and for the first time it was a smile that held no fear, no doubt, just quiet strength. She reached for my wrist, pulling my hand from her waist and guiding it gently away from the tools on the bench. This time, it wasn't about the work. It was about something else. "Let's go outside," she said, her voice steady. "We've done enough work for today." She didn't have to say more. I knew what she meant. We left the barn together, stepping out into the cool evening air. The stars were visible now, the sky a clear, dark canvas above. The world was quiet, just the rustle of the trees and the soft sound of the earth beneath our feet. We stood together on the porch, Elena's head resting against my shoulder. The porch light was still on, and for the first time in a long time, everything felt right, like we had finally built something that would last. "Ready to go back inside?" I asked, after a long pause, my voice low. She nodded, the smile still there, but this time it was full of something else. Not just peace, but the quiet, steady strength of someone who had learned how to stand tall in their own story. "Let's go," she said. "But we're not going back to who we were before." I took her hand, and together we walked back into the barn, where the work wasn't done, but the foundation had been laid. The music box played softly in the background, the notes crisp and clear, echoing through the space like a promise. We weren't just surviving anymore. We were building something new. Together.